On May 22, 1960, the ground beneath southern Chile moved for 10 full minutes. Not 10 seconds, not 30, 10 minutes. Most major earthquakes wrap up in under a minute. This one just kept going, wave after wave of violent shaking, long after most buildings had already given up. When it finally stopped, one city was permanently underwater, and a nearby coastline had been shoved upward by nearly 80 feet. Same earthquake, same fault. Two completely opposite outcomes separated by just a few miles. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how one rupture pulled those two things off at the same time. First, the raw numbers, because they matter here. The 1960 Valdivia earthquake clocked in at a magnitude 9.5. That's the largest earthquake ever recorded on any instrument anywhere on Earth. Not the largest in that region. Not the largest that century. The largest ever. Full stop. The fault that broke wasn't some modest crack in the crust. It tore across roughly 600 miles of the boundary where the Nazca plate dives underneath the South American plate. That's a rupture zone stretching longer than the entire state of California. The energy released was roughly equivalent to all other earthquakes combined across a full decade. Those aren't metaphors to make it sound dramatic. Those are the actual physics of what happened that afternoon. So here's where most people's mental model of earthquakes breaks down. When you think about earthquake damage, you probably picture a few seconds of violent shaking. A building cracks, a bridge wobbles, maybe something falls. 30 seconds later, it's over. Engineers designed for exactly that window. But this quake didn't give anything a 30-second window. It gave everything a 10-minute window. Buildings that absorbed the first minute of shaking, buildings that might have survived a normal major earthquake, got hit again and again. Cumulative damage stacks fast. A column that cracks at minute 2 is a column that shatters at minute 6. Magnitude tells you how much energy released. Duration tells you how long that energy keeps punishing everything in its path. Down in southern Chile that day, duration was the real killer. Now here's where the story splits into two very different directions. The city of Valdivia sat about 15 kilometers inland from the coast, built along the Chilean River. During those 10 minutes of shaking, the ground beneath Valdivia didn't just shake, it dropped. The city subsided roughly 2 meters, nearly 6 feet, as the crust beneath it compressed and settled under the tectonic load. 2 meters doesn't sound catastrophic until you remember that Valdivia was already a river city, already sitting close to sea level in several neighborhoods. Drop the land by 2 meters, and the river doesn't stay in the river anymore. Tidal waters pushed inland. Low-lying streets filled permanently. That flooding wasn't a temporary condition that drained away after the shaking stopped. The ground had physically moved to a new, lower position. The flooding was the new normal, and the tsunami made everything worse before anyone had time to process the subsidence at all. The seafloor rupture that broke across 600 miles of ocean crust displaced an extraordinary volume of water. Tsunami waves built almost immediately offshore. About 15 minutes after the main shock, those waves hit the Chilean coast. Along the stretch of coastline directly above the rupture zone, waves climbed as high as 80 feet. For Valdivia, which had already sunk, the tsunami wasn't arriving at a city on solid high ground. It was arriving at a city that had already been partially swallowed by its own river. The 1-2 sequence of subsidence followed by tsunami is one of the reasons the damage in and around Valdivia was so complete and so lasting. But here's what's genuinely strange about how this rupture worked. While Valdivia was sinking, other sections of coastline were doing the exact opposite. Some areas near the rupture zone were thrust upward by 6 meters or more during the same event. In certain locations, land that had been seafloor was suddenly exposed above the waterline. Marine charts drawn before May 22, 1960, became immediately useless because the coastline they described no longer existed. Harbors that ships had navigated for decades were suddenly too shallow. Beaches that had never existed before appeared overnight. One fault, one rupture, one 10-minute shaking event. Sections of coastline were simultaneously dropping below sea level and rising dozens of feet into the air. The reason the same earthquake could do both things comes down to how subduction zone ruptures actually behave. When a massive slab of oceanic crust suddenly lurches under a continental plate, the rock above it doesn't all respond identically. Areas directly above the locked portion of the fault that suddenly releases get dragged downward as elastic stress unloads. Other areas, farther from that locked zone, experience rebound uplift as surrounding rock snaps back into a new equilibrium. Think of it like pressing down hard on one end of a flexible board and suddenly releasing. The end you press drops, but the middle section can arc upward. The Chilean coast was living through a version of that on a geological scale, played out across hundreds of miles of terrain simultaneously. Now here's the secondary disaster that nearly turned this into something even more catastrophic. Most people have never heard of it. During the earthquake, massive landslides blocked the outflow of Riñihue Lake, the lowest lake in a chain of 7 connected lakes fed by constant river inflow. With the San Pedro River suddenly dammed by debris, the lake level started rising fast. Every additional meter of water in that lake represented 20 million cubic meters of volume. Engineers calculated that if the natural debris dam gave way all at once, a wall of water would hit every downstream town and ultimately reach the already flooded city of Valdivia in less than 5 hours. The river had the capacity to carry 400 cubic meters per second under controlled conditions. A sudden dam failure would have sent a catastrophically larger surge downstream with essentially no warning. This would have been a second disaster, layered directly on top of the first. What happened next was one of the more remarkable engineering responses in South American history. Emergency crews worked around the clock to manually cut drainage channels through the debris blockage. The goal wasn't to blast it open all at once. That would have triggered exactly the catastrophic release they were trying to prevent. Instead, teams worked to slowly lower the lake level in a controlled way, channeling water through at manageable rates and buying more time for downstream towns to evacuate and prepare. It took weeks of continuous effort. The lake level dropped gradually. The dam held long enough to allow controlled drainage. A disaster that could have killed tens of thousands of additional people was averted, not by sophisticated modern technology, but by workers with equipment manually racing against a rising lake. The global reach of what happened that day extended well beyond Chile. Tsunami waves crossed the entire Pacific Ocean. Hawaii recorded waves over 30 feet when they arrived roughly 15 hours after the earthquake. Hilo was hit hard with significant casualties and destruction. Japan, more than 10,000 kilometers from the epicenter, saw waves arrive and cause serious damage along its coastline. The Philippines recorded impacts as well. The 1960 event made it undeniably clear that a large enough subduction earthquake didn't just create a regional disaster. It created a Pacific-wide one. Scientists and governments watching the wave propagate in real time across the ocean, with essentially no coordinated warning system in place, pushed hard for the infrastructure that eventually became the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center. The 1960 earthquake didn't just reshape the Chilean coastline. It reshaped how the entire scientific community thought about early warning systems and international disaster coordination going